Yeah, Mr. D, man, rest in peace, Pope Francis. Yeah, his funeral was today. I was telling Sound Engraver, and I actually posted on my private Facebook page too, that I disagreed with Pope Francis on a lot of political and philosophical issues, but I never really doubted him as having a good heart. And his encyclical on Scripture I thought was great. But one thing I think I'll always remember him for is the heart he had for special needs children. There's this clip, you can look it up on YouTube if you look up like Pope Francis and girl with autism or whatever. And this happened like some 8 years ago, maybe something like that. But he was giving one of his addresses, and this little girl who was on the autistic spectrum slipped through the security and got up on the stage. And he was telling his, he was like, no, let her stay, let her stay, let her stay. And he was doing his, and she's like dancing and doing cartwheels and, has no concept of personal space. He's like standing right up there next to him. And he just calmly, delivering his address. But he also, it would say, isn't she beautiful? Isn't she such a beautiful child? And everyone's clapping. And he said at the end, though, which I thought was really great. Now, he didn't know. He just saw this girl acting in a way which clearly means she had some sort of special needs or something. So, and this might be lost in translation too, because he's speaking Italian. But the translation said, clearly she's got an illness. She doesn't know what she's doing. She has an illness. Now, you wouldn't really describe a girl with autism or a child with autism as having an illness necessarily, but he didn't know, or maybe that's lost in translation. But his point was, how many of you were praying for her, or how many of you were praying for her parents sitting there watching, probably feeling mortified, and so forth. And I don't know, he just had a good heart for him. There's a lot of instances where he had special needs children up on his, seat with him or next to him and stuff, from all different types and different special needs and whatnot. So I always appreciated him for that. But after the period of mourning's over, they'll have a conclave. We'll probably have a new pope around May 10th, 12th-ish, something like that, depending. But that's actually, it ties into a little bit of one of the topics I had for tonight. Maybe I'll just talk about that now. I don't really know how far we'll go with it. And I'll shut up and get to my other couple of reviews here, Oh, yeah, Padre Cosinero is here. Sorry, I'm going to get your name. So the papal motto for Pope Francis is from Scripture. With mercy, he called them. What a fitting message for the vigil of divine mercy tonight. Yep. And upon the pond, Novia for Pope Francis that began today. Yeah. Yeah, he was, we had a little memorial of him in our parish tonight, too, and everything. So, yeah. But, yeah, I'll come back to Pope Francis for a second, because I promise it's relevant to something that I talk about. Sometimes I'll talk about what's going on in today's culture, today's society, if it's linked somehow to the stories or to the archetypes that I talk about. So, for example, I've talked before about how, you can have too much of the trickster's influence in society at any given time. The trickster blurs boundaries. That's what he does in our stories and whatnot. And you can have too much of that in society at a time, which kind of gives over to nihilism, or just sort of like nothing sacred, or well, you don't really believe that, though. Oh, you believe that? Well, yeah, but you don't really believe that either. So you can have stuff like that. What I see going on today a little bit is something I tell my students to look out for all the time when they're writing. Especially if you're writing sort of an argumentative essay, or trying to it doesn't even have to be writing, just, you're thinking about talking to people and persuading them or whatever. You have to look out for false binaries. And false binary is anytime you take an issue and present it as though it's this side versus this side. And the example I usually give for that, I mean, you can give a ton of examples, but one of the examples I usually give is, I say, take the issue of abortion. I say, if you walk into any room and ask people, okay, divide yourself up. If you're pro-choice, stand over there. And if you're pro-life, stand over here. The room will just automatically divide itself, right? Because we're just trained to think of this issue as a binary issue. And I'll say, okay, now once you have the room divided like that, there absolutely are some people who will be as far to the one side as possible. Like, being a Catholic, I'm almost all the way to the pro-life side with no nuances or anything like that in between us. So, but most people, if you just go into a room and just ask them to, just ask the average random grouping of people questions like this, you'll find that they actually fall somewhere in between. Now, say, for example, you'll have people who say that they're pro-choice, but they'll say, well, yeah, except for, you can't just have like 20 abortions because that's your birth control or something like that, or likewise, you'll have people who say, well, they're pro-life, but unless it's a case of rape or incest, then I'm okay with it, So that's the point is, this issue that is we're taught to think of as this side versus this side, cold, clear cut. Most people in the world have some sort of variation or place in the scale in between the two polar opposite sides. And that's important, especially if you're trying to persuade somebody, because I say, let's pretend that you were on one of these polar opposite sides, and you're trying to, let's say that you're you're pro-choice, you're all the way on pro-choice, and you're trying to convince people to come over your side, but you're characterizing everybody who thinks of themselves as pro-life is a bunch of evil, they don't even care about a woman who's been raped or blah blah blah, well, yeah, you're going to lose half your audience there, because there are plenty of people that would think of themselves as pro-life who maybe don't think that, and you might have otherwise swayed them a little bit to your side, and the same thing's true on the opposite side. If you're staunch pro-life and you're trying to argue you can't treat everybody that calls himself pro-choice like, oh, it's just a bunch of evil baby killers, that's more about you venting than it is about you possibly convincing somebody to come a little bit your way on the scale. And it makes a lot of sense when you look at it, but we are so manipulated these days into emotional responses, especially when it comes to culture. We see it in politics, certainly, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But one of the things I saw with Pope Francis, even among a lot of Catholics, I would talk about this or that. When I was still had the time to keep up my Catholic Bible Geek channel, I would say something about Pope Francis or this and that, and I would get Catholic people that I've known to be Catholics coming there. Comrade Francis isn't my Pope. Like, well, then you're not Catholic then. I mean, that's just how that works. Like, if you don't recognize, the leader of an organization that you want to be a part of as by default your leader, maybe you disagree with him on a lot of things, and that's legit. That's fine. I disagree with Pope Francis on a lot of things, and that's allowed as a Catholic. It's not, you don't believe that they don't get to say Simon Says or whatever. It's not that kind of deal. But a lot of people just like, if this person, and you see it in organizations or just even in fandoms, well, this actor or this director said this once, so I'm done with all of their movies and all of their everything. I'm not going to do anything else to support them. And I like this movie. This is one of my favorite films, but they had something to do with it, so I can't watch that anymore. You you have people just, it's all or nothing. They think in false binaries about these terms. We see it politically now. Like, and again, I'm not even speaking politics here, so you can think whatever you want to on either side of this. I'm just pointing out the false binary issue. One of the big hot button issues now that's being talked about is whether non-U.S. citizens or illegal immigrants, that's just the technical term, and the person who's here illegally, should have due process to be determined that they're illegal and be deported, right? And you've got a lot of members of Democrats in Congress going down to see this Garcia guy in San Salvador and just really making this show over how much they care about people and they care about these people. Well, if you cared about people, why couldn't you even stand up for the victims or the little boy who survived brain cancer? When Pope Trump gave his address to both houses of Congress or whatever. You clearly, I'm just talking about these Democratic congressmen, the ones who are making such a fuss right now. You clearly are just anti-Trump. So if Trump is for something, then you're absolutely against it. Like, I can't see them with any integrity that they just care about the well-being of people when they could care less about that little boy who'd been through so many brain surgeries or whatever, didn't even cheer for him, just stone faced because Trump was saying something about him. It's like, so you lose your integrity with me. You lose your credibility. If you were had a little bit more integrity, maybe I'd be willing more to hear what you said about this other issue or whatever, And we see that in there, Republicans or conservatives, guilty of that kind of thing too. But it's something we can learn it in stories, right? That you can't have characters who are so two-dimensional that they're just you're always against them. It's different if you have an elemental evil or aspirational hero. I've talked about those, the two polar opposites of hero villain, which should be all the way to the ends. Like I said in my example of abortion, you do need some people or some entities, if you're talking about story characters or whatever, that are on either side of the scale, because that sort of defines the playing field. But you need nuance, you need variations in between. Otherwise, you really limit the audience that you reach. As a storyteller, certainly, but also just as somebody, if you have opinions on things that are going on in the world. I gave the example of religion. I gave the example there of religion or politics. So whether you have an opinion or a commentary on any of those issues, but if you're just going to harp away on one side and everybody across this one line here is evil and doesn't agree with you because they don't have the right letter next to their name or the right whatever, then you're not going to, only people you're going to reach are the people that already think the same way as you do. I have my students sometimes go on Twitter, or X now, and look at posts by either celebrities or even, politicians or whatever about this or that issue, some important issue. And I'll say, okay, now who's going to be swayed by that post, the way it's written? And the answer, even if it's an issue that they agree with, they have to originally say, yeah, no one's going to be swayed by that because it's just an angry vent. And there's room for angry venting, right? About certain issues anyway. If you're talking about, I've certainly done my fair share of venting about Zack Snyder's Superman or whatever, but I never thought or never intended that vent to go out and convince people, So you got to know your audience. You got to be able to think, in the issues of real life, in the realities around us, and in the many different positions people can have within any issue. You want to avoid that false binary.